The purposes and benefits of derivatives. Before we get into the specifics, let's take a look at how the Chicago Board of Trade was formed. Let's say this is the United States and this is Chicago. In the mid-19th century, Chicago was becoming a hub for agricultural products. Farmers in different parts of the country, generally in the Midwest, would bring their corn and their wheat and their soybean to Chicago and sell it over here. The problem was that most of the produce would come to Chicago at roughly the same time. If in a particular season the crop was really good or the quantity was high, then the prices would fall. In other seasons, if there was a shortage of produce, then the prices would be very high. So there was a considerable degree of volatility in the market for agricultural products. In fact, there were times when the prices would be so low that it was more cost effective for farmers to dump their produce into the Chicago River as opposed to taking it back. Some businessmen saw this volatility and the inefficiency and decided to create the Chicago Board of Trade, which is the first formal or first modern futures market. Some businessmen in Chicago saw this as an opportunity and created the Chicago Board of Trade. This is a futures exchange, and what the Chicago Board of Trade allowed was for farmers to lock in a price before they deliver their product. So if the product was to be delivered in the summer or their produce was to be delivered in the summer, then in winter or in spring, the farmers could lock in a price at which they will sell. Clearly, this benefited the farmers because it hedged against the risk of prices falling, and it helped the party which was buying by locking in prices and hedging against the risk of prices being too high. So everybody benefited and the volatility also came down. There is a little more detail in the curriculum on this, but as long as you've understood what I've just said, you should be in good shape. Now let's look at the specific purposes and benefits of derivatives: risk allocation, transfer, and management. The main benefit of derivatives here is that derivatives allow us to manage risk without trading the underlying asset. For example, let's say that you own a given stock and you are concerned about the stock falling. In a world without derivatives, the only way for you to manage this risk would be to sell the underlying stock or to sell this stock. But if you do have derivatives, then there are several other options. You could use put options, for example. Put options will allow you to make money if the stock price falls. So you could buy an appropriate number of put options to hedge against the risk of the stock falling. You could go short on a futures contract which is based on the stock, or you could take a short position in a forward contract. So the point is that with derivatives, there are several ways for you to manage your risk without actually trading this particular stock. Next point is information discovery. And within information discovery, there are two key elements that you need to be aware of: price discovery and implied volatility. What price discovery really means is that derivatives markets, and specifically futures markets, make it more efficient to get information about the price of a particular underlying. For example, if you are trying to figure out the price of gold, you could go to the spot market, but then the question is which spot market, because the trading of gold in the spot market is very decentralized. So the most efficient thing to do is to look at the futures contract prices of contracts that are expiring as soon as possible, for contracts that are expiring very soon. And that is a very efficient way to discover or determine the appropriate price for gold. The other point is implied volatility. We'll see this in more detail when we study the different kinds of derivative contracts later, but the high level point is this. The price of a particular kind of derivative, let's say a call option, is based on several variables. And if you think about a particular model, let's say that we have a model called the Black-Scholes-Merton model. The way we come up with the price of a call option is by feeding different inputs. So for a particular call option, we'll feed the underlying stock price, the exercise price, the volatility, the risk-free rate, and then this model will give us the value of the call option. Now, if we work backwards, and we know the value of the call option in the market. So a given call option is trading at a certain price. We know the stock price, we know the exercise price, we know the risk-free rate. We can then determine the implied volatility. And the reason it is called implied volatility is that this volatility, and this is the volatility of the underlying stock, is not explicitly known. But we can figure out what is the volatility number that is implied by the price of the option in the market. So derivative markets allow us to determine the implied volatility. Next point has to do with operational advantages. There are three major advantages that you need to be aware of. The first one is that derivatives allow us to reduce transaction costs. And the idea is this. Let's say you want to invest in a fund that is based on the S&P 500. One strategy is to simply go invest in that particular fund where the underlying shares are based on the S&P 500. The other strategy might be to take a long position in a futures contract which is based on the S&P 500. Typically, this strategy of taking a long position in a futures contract is much more cost effective than going and buying shares in a fund which are based on the S&P 500. And both the futures contract and the fund will give you the same sort of exposure. The second point has to do with liquidity. Typically, futures contracts are more liquid than directly investing in a fund. And the final point is that it is very easy to take a short position. Let's say that you have a view that the stock market will go down. The best way to take advantage of this is to take a short position in a futures contract that is based on the S&P 500. Our final point has to do with market efficiency. And we talk about market efficiency in other parts of the CFA Level 1 curriculum. But very briefly, a market is efficient if prices reflect all available information and it is not possible to make abnormal profits over long periods of time. Another way of putting it is that if securities are not at their proper price, then the market is inefficient. Now, what do derivatives do? With derivatives, the transaction costs are lower. It is easy to take short positions. Derivative instruments allow us to easily take advantage of any mispricing, and therefore the mispricing is removed faster. In other words, derivatives allow us to remove inefficiencies from the market faster and take us towards an efficient market. Criticisms and misuses of derivatives. Before getting into the specifics, let's recognize the fact that financial markets have cycles. And these cycles include asset bubbles. Bubbles are where asset prices are inflated, or we can say that asset prices are above intrinsic value. The prices are more than what they should be based on fundamentals. And then when these bubbles become excessively inflated, potentially bubbles burst, and then the market crashes. After every crash, lots of studies are done to explain the causes of the crash. The recent example is the credit crisis of 2007-2008. Typically, these reports blame derivatives as a primary cause for the crash. The primary arguments made against derivatives is that they involve a lot of speculation, and in fact, they are so speculative that there isn't much difference between derivatives and gambling. Some people actually say that derivatives are like legalized gambling. This criticism is sometimes taken one step further to say that derivatives cause the overall financial system to be destabilized. Let's look at these criticisms in a little more detail. First, speculation. Clearly, there is some speculation involved in derivatives, but if you think about it, if you have entities that want to hedge their risk, so let's call them the hedgers, they can only hedge their risk if somebody is willing to buy that risk. We need a counterparty. Speculators are the counterparty. Without speculators, hedgers will not be able to hedge their risk. So speculators do play an important part. Generally in society, speculators are much maligned, but if you think about it, there is speculation involved in lots of activities. Even if we buy a stock, we are speculating that the company will do well. If I leave my job and start a small company, I know that most startups fail. So here also I am speculating. Is that a bad thing? Not necessarily. So the point is that speculation is not necessarily bad. Another important distinction between derivatives and gambling is that with gambling, only a few people benefit. In fact, very few actually benefit from gambling, and one might say that overall society is worse off. With derivatives, on the other hand, if they are used properly, then they make the financial markets more efficient, and we talked about that in the previous section. By making financial markets more efficient, society overall benefits. So we can say that derivatives have a broad beneficial impact on society, whereas gambling only benefits a very small number of people. Let us now come to the second argument, that derivatives destabilize the financial system. And this argument does have some merit. Generally, derivatives involve a high degree of leverage. Let's say we have a speculator who is using derivatives and using excessive leverage. This speculator has borrowed from A, that's where the leverage is coming from. Let's say entity A has borrowed from B and entity B has borrowed from C. Now, if the speculator defaults, what happens? That means that A is in trouble. A doesn't get back the money that it is supposed to. This means that A will default. If A defaults, that means that B is not getting its money, so B defaults, and so on. What you are noticing here is that a default by the speculator impacts the overall financial system, and that is the point. This clearly has happened. Classic examples include long-term capital management. In 1998, they took excessive leverage, and then when they crashed, the financial system was impacted. So, as I mentioned before, this argument has some weight. However, the curriculum points out that the issue with high leverage is not an issue that impacts derivatives alone. There are several other ways in which high leverage can be taken without the use of derivatives, And that too will have the same impact on financial markets. So the larger point is that derivatives are extremely powerful and they need to be used properly. If they are not used properly, then the impact can be disastrous. Another criticism is that derivatives are extremely complex. The financial market often employs mathematicians and scientists to come up with models that try to explain how the markets will operate. These models frequently fail, and then the financial market and those who operate in these markets are heavily criticized. But we need to recognize the fact that when mathematicians and scientists come up with models which try to explain derivatives, what they are trying to do is extremely difficult, because underneath these derivatives is the actions of human beings, which are extremely difficult to model. Now let's take a look at
Example 8.
from the curriculum. Which of the following is not an advantage of derivative markets? They are less volatile than spot markets. This does not look right. They facilitate the allocation of risk in the market. This is correct. They incur low transaction costs than spot markets. This is a true statement. So A is the correct answer. Which of the following pieces of information is not conveyed by at least one type of derivative? The volatility of the underlying. I gave you an example earlier where the price of a call option tells you a little bit about the volatility or the implied volatility of the underlying asset. So this conveys some information and is therefore not the right answer. The most widely used strategy of the underlying, I will mark this. This probably looks like the right answer. The price at which uncertainty in the underlying can be eliminated. I did not explicitly talk about this earlier, but I'll mention it here. Derivatives do allow us to determine the price at which uncertainty in the underlying can be eliminated. And to understand this, let's say that you own a particular stock and you want to buy an option, let's say a put option, to eliminate the uncertainty associated with this stock. Now clearly, if the uncertainty is high, then the put option will be worth more. If the uncertainty is low, then the put option will be worth less. So the price of the put option tells us a little bit about the uncertainty involved. So this is a true statement about a particular kind of derivative. The correct answer therefore is B, the most widely used strategy of the underlying. The derivative itself does not tell us about strategies that employ that particular kind of derivative. So B is the best answer. Which of the following responds to the criticism that derivatives can be destabilizing to the underlying market? Market crashes and panics have occurred since long before derivatives existed. This is actually a true statement. The curriculum gives us examples where crashes occurred before derivatives were used. So if we blame all crashes on derivatives, then that would not be true. A is therefore the correct answer, but let us also look at the other options. Derivatives are sufficiently regulated that they cannot destabilize the spot market. This is not true. At times, derivatives do destabilize the spot market, especially if they are not used properly. The transaction costs of derivatives are high enough to keep their use at a minimum level. This is a completely untrue statement.